Welcome back to the Food Forest, everybody. Today's video is going to be about mistakes that I've made in building my permaculture food forest. I think it's really easy for content producers to go around showing you all the nice parts of their garden. I think what's more important though is to help people get started. And we do that by showing our mistakes. I think showing my mistakes and having you avoid them goes a lot more towards your benefit than creating some kind of false illusion that I'm perfect and have never made any mistakes. So let's get started. These are the biggest mistakes that I've made that you can avoid when you're making a permaculture food forest. Sometimes we know what the right thing to do is, and we take half measures in order to get there. Right here is a perfect example of a mistake that I made this year. Earlier on in the season, I did a video about thinning your peaches. So I knew that peaches will put on a big crop one year and a smaller crop the next year. And on the big crop here, you have to thin them out or else the tree just gets overloaded. I thinned out probably half the peaches or more on my tree, but I kind of deep down inside knew I needed to do more. And the price for that failure was that I lost massive branches on my peach tree this year. So I can show you the nice angles of my peach tree and make them look fantastic, but I can also show you these ugly sides. And this is going to create a further complication down the road this year when I go to prune, because I've already lost a substantial mass of above ground growth on my trees. And I'm gonna be limited on how much I can actually prune these back this year now because they've already lost so much up top. Hopefully though, they survive. I think they should. But what matters is that if you know you need to take an action to do something, go extra safe and do whatever you need to do in order to maintain the health of your trees. These are huge investments, so make sure that you protect them. Learning from my lesson, I came out and basically took half of the pears off of this tree just to get the weight off as these pears get heavier. And just looking at some of these branches, I think I'll take another bunch of pears off just to get some more weight off the branches. Mistake number 2 is right here. This is my next level compost pile. The mistake that I made came after, when in the spring I took all the seedlings that I had started for my annuals and I had extras that I just couldn't fit anywhere else, and I planted them all around this compost pile and down the swale in the back. Unfortunately, these plants are doing really well and they're some of my best plants. On the plus side, I got some amazing tomatoes and melons and squash growing out of what was otherwise kind of a useless area. The negative is that I can't turn my compost pile to keep it aerobic without damaging those plants. That compost represents my next year's fertility. Okay, so mistake number 3 is right here, and this is my seabuckthorn. The mistake is that I tried to do this too cheap. So when I started out my food forest, I spent my money on fruit trees and I wanted to, I was just discovering permaculture at that time and I wanted to flesh in the rest of the guilds as cheaply as possible. And I think that that's a good endeavor. However, what we have to be really careful of is what are the genetics that we're introducing into our food forest. So I had done an Ecosia search on seabuckthorn in Ontario. I came across an environmental assessment where a Lowe's parking lot was being investigated to see if it could be used to build something else for a permit, and they found seabuckthorn in that parking lot. So I ended up going to the site and I found it and dug it up and I brought it to my site. So why is that a mistake? Instead of having a massive thorny small berry seabuckthorn plant, I would have larger berries, smaller thorns, and the runners that would be sending up, I would be much happier about those showing up in my food forest instead of these long, massive thorned wild varieties. So I think my lesson to you is that if you want to save money on, say, the flowers that are going into your food forest, things that are lower value that maybe you're planting for nature, go nuts. Don't do it with stuff that you're going to be consuming or using as your own personal medicinal plants. And don't do it with anything that you're going to be propagating a lot, because you're going to be propagating those subpar wild genetics. And you can see I have this stuff popping up all over the place. I'm kind of okay with that because I can chop it and drop it. It's not a big deal. But if all of these bushes that were popping up were a better variety, I'd kind of be happier. Mistake number 4 is going to be errors that I did when I was sheet mulching. I have a sheet mulching guide. If you're going to sheet mulch, then definitely check that out. For anyone who doesn't know, sheet mulching is basically how we reset our soil, our grass, whatever we're going to be building our food forest on, so that we can get a nice, fresh, clean slate to build a food forest on top of. Now, the first mistake is that I didn't use any cardboard on my first patch. What I wanted in this specific area here was a walking or driving path down to my lower area. And I wanted to basically do it cheap. I wanted to do it with wood chips instead of paving it or constantly having to mow it. What I ended up doing was just basically collecting wood chips and dumping them on the ground. I put these wood chips like a foot thick, and as you can see, it all has turned into grass again. And believe it or not, this whole area was wood chipped to a foot thick. And you can kind of see them down there, you know, the wood chips below all of these creeping, crawling grasses, and they just built themselves right on top because there was no smothering layer to kill them. So if you don't use a smothering layer, expect your wood chip paths to turn into this. This was all mulched the exact same way. And this stuff is just happily growing with a wood chip mulch now. And all this plant, all this grass is perfectly happy. Now let's talk about how you can mess cardboard up. There's 2 main reasons for that, and they'll fill out the last 3 sheet mulching mistakes. They're both to do with cardboard, and that is number 1, I didn't go thick enough, and number 2, I didn't keep it moist. So this here is an area of my food forest that I had just sheet mulched this spring. And in this area that you're looking at here, I had gone really thick with the cardboard with a really solid overlap. I had overlapped each piece a good solid 3 to 4 inches. So I went double layer and I went massive overlap. And you can see that it's held up really well. There hasn't been a lot of weeds growing, popping back up. However, then I ran out of cardboard. So here's an area where we kind of started to run out of cardboard and we didn't put a good double overlap on, and we started to see some dog strangling vine popping up. Now what these will actually do is, well, you can see it here, they'll actually run underneath the one cardboard. They'll run right underneath it and they'll root kind of on the way as they do, and then they'll push up between the 2 pieces of cardboard and then pop up. So we had a piece of cardboard here, and we had underneath it a piece of cardboard here with a bit of an overlap, but it actually just popped up and pushed its way up through the 2 pieces, and it's perfectly happy and mulched now. So now what we have is a little bit of a battle that we have to constantly come back here, and we have to chop these out, we have to drop them down, and we just have to starve the plant out. But if I don't do that, these plants will actually now get established in my freshly mulched area, and they'll be perfectly happy. So for some plants that really spread and runner underground, the only way you're going to be able to stop them is if you overlap cardboard after cardboard on top of them. Go 2 layers deep at least, and tons of overlap. And then go thick with the wood chips when you're on top of that. That's the only way you're going to be able to get rid of a really pernicious plant that is also a rhizome runner. So now we're on the back side of the food forest, and up here I'd done a sheet mulch and I was planting out to some apple trees. And on this north side, I kind of didn't finish it very well. I put down cardboard, a little bit of wood chips, but not thick enough. And what happened was the cardboard dried out. So this is going to be the 3rd way you can screw up sheet mulching. And in this area, it might be hard for me to find because I've been soaking it to try to fix that problem. Ignore this is not ragweed, this is actually goldenrod. And you can see it's a very valuable pollinator plant. So a lot of people hate on something like this because they think it's ragweed, but it's not. This is actually solidago, this is goldenrod. Sorry for that brief aside, but the problem when cardboard dries out is it becomes hydrophobic. and that means that it repels water. And what that means is that it's going to last and stay there forever until you can rehydrate it. In fact, here's some right here. So believe it or not, this piece of cardboard is 5 years old. And I actually expect that one of the reasons why this part here looks like it does, and that part there looks much more vibrant, is that this cardboard broke down and water can get back at the soil again. However, in this part here, the cardboard never broke down and it stayed as a barrier to water, and therefore also a barrier to oxygen down to the soil level. And you can see that plants really struggled. I have a whole bunch of raspberries growing in here, but none in this area where this cardboard has basically, you know, it still exists. Just like maybe a small corner of it, but then you've got more of it here. And here we have another mistake that I've made, which is leaving the tape on the boxes. This is tape from 5 years ago. So the way to fix this is to make sure that when you put the cardboard on, you give it a really good soaking wet water. And then you also put a lot of wood chips on top so that that water doesn't just evaporate away. You can water your cardboard as much as you want. If you don't trap that moisture in there, then the cardboard is going to dry out and it's going to become hydrophobic. And once it becomes hydrophobic, you might as well be putting porcelain plates or, you know, a tarp on the ground, because water's not going to be able to get through that. So for anyone who does seed starts and they use peat moss, and by the way, you shouldn't use peat moss because it's really ecologically damaging. Try to use other stuff. But if you have ever used peat moss before, you'll know that when peat moss dries out, it kind of does the same thing. It goes hydrophobic and water can't get in. And the only way to fix that problem is to take that peat moss and sink it and soak it in water. Get it wet again. Once it's wet again, it'll become like a sponge. But when it's dry, it's like a water barrier. So the same thing happens to your cardboard. Make sure that when you sheet mulch your fresh wood chip gardens, that you're getting them nice and wet so that that cardboard will break down in 2 to 6 months instead of still being there 5 years later. And make sure that you take off glossy print and tape, because that stuff won't break down, and glossy print also has some nasty chemicals that'll get into your soils. So make sure that you get rid of that and you'll be good to go for sheet mulching. Now, one mistake that I've only just started to remedy is putting a higher price on fleshing out the rest of my guild, specifically with stuff like flowers. I think it's a huge push to people when they start their food forests that we go and we plant all of our fruit trees that we want, and we kind of ignore the insect level. But then we get all these fruit trees that we planted and they start having pest and disease issues. Trees want to be in dense polycultures. Trees need insects for pollination. Trees have pests that eat the leaves and eat the fruit. And you really want to have a robust insect biome when we're planting our trees. So I think it's really important that a new permaculture food forest also have the flowers go in right off the get-go, and not like what I did where I planted my food forest out and then the flowers were an afterthought and I only fixed it like 3 years later. Forgive the noise of the waterfall, it's very loud, but having an area like this, even if it's not right where your food forest fruit trees are, but it's somewhat in vicinity, will really help minimize problems that you're going to get down the road when you have maybe pests getting out of control. And planting a few extra flowers, not only for beauty, but for attracting predators to those pests, it's really, really important. Look at this goldenrod. It's just swarming with insect life. And this is what you want to see on your lands. Don't underestimate the importance of adding flowers into your food forest systems. Along the same line of thought, another mistake that I made was waiting too long to put water into my system. It increases the diversity of the plants in your area, it increases the insect diversity, and water is the source of all life on Earth. You'll be floored at the amount of wildlife that bringing in water into your system will do for your food forest. And the more life that you bring in, remember, that's all free energy inputs. And if you can add in flowers and water at the same time, and you can create pooling areas for birds, then you can really, really do your food forest a whole lot of good. And it doesn't have to be expensive. This was a pond that I hand dug. The liner was basically salvaged as scrap, and the rock was found out of a farmer's field when they plow and they pile the rocks. This whole pond is free. I did buy a pump to circulate the water that's off right now. So circulating the water is important because you want to get oxygen in the water to prevent mosquitoes and promote dragonflies. But even a pond like this with a little bit of duckweed will attract tons and tons of wildlife. And it doesn't have to be expensive. It can be just something as simple as this. But having water somewhat near your food forest is so important, especially for getting birds coming. Okay, so this last mistake is going to be something that I continue to do and probably will continue to do. And that is plant within your capability to harvest it when your plants are in their full production. Keep in mind, I didn't know anything about gardening before I started 5 years ago. I literally knew absolutely nothing. I think I started a bean plant in like grade 1 or 2 in a paper towel in my classroom. That was the extent of my gardening 5 years ago. So I was coming from there, and I found out about permaculture, and at the same time, I was learning more about cooking and food and the nutrient value of fresh grown food versus the stuff in the store. I was learning about how, they ship strawberries when they're basically green, and they blanket them in nitrogen and then they ripen on the truck. And I learned, that the ripening process is something that is constantly putting nutrients into the food. So if you interrupt that early to ship things across the country, you're reducing the nutrient quality of your food. And one really important thing that I've learned, and that I have a feeling I will continue to learn and get beat into me over the next couple of years, is that a fruit tree makes a crap load of food. This year we had massive production out of our peaches, and our pears are coming, and our apples are also coming. I'm standing underneath probably hundreds of apples in my apple tree. And those peaches that we got this year wiped me out. It was so much work to harvest them all and process them all and get them into my freezers that I'm kind of at my limit for what I can do. And I'm a little bit fearful of what happens when my plums, my nectarines, my pawpaws, my persimmons, my jujubes, and then the nut trees, when all that stuff starts growing and entering their max peak production years, I actually don't know how on earth I can possibly keep it going, especially if I'm back to work full time and I'm not gaining 2 hours a day of commute just because I'm working from home, so I can actually harvest after work instead of driving in traffic after work. So that's a challenge that I'm gonna face in the future, is how on earth do I get all this food and not have it just fall on the floor and spoil? And I'm already having a problem with it now. I'm really, really fearful for what that looks like in the future. One of the reasons that I did this permaculture food forest is that I'm kind of creating a side hobby for my retirement. And I can hire people to pick. I can open my land up as a U-pick. I can sell at a farmer's market if I want, just some extra money. But I think I really underestimated just how much fruit or nuts an actual fruit tree that's doing well will produce. We're talking thousands of pounds of food. And then when you figure that you plant 100 of them, it's a lot of work. So make sure that when you plant your food forest, that whatever you want to be doing in 7 years, you account for that. Whatever level of work you want to be doing in your food forest, figure that out and then design how much food you actually plant based on that. Because if you are anything like me and you get addicted to planting these trees, unfortunately, it doesn't line up with my capability as one person or even a family of collecting that food. So I have a looming problem on the horizon of how on earth am I gonna harvest from 100-ish fruit and nut trees, but that's a problem that maybe is kind of good to have, but it is going to be a problem. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope some of these things can help you prevent some problems that you'll do in your food forest, and I'll see you on the next one.